Greetings, rebels, and welcome to my glorious YouTube channel where we discuss Star Wars Destiny stuff all day long, or at least twice a week. So today I want to discuss a little talked about topic, and that's the control archetype, or at least how we conceptualize it in Destiny. Since Empire at War dropped, I've been on this kick of building mill decks, and all of them are hero based because I'm a hero player, right? And if you know anything about Destiny, the words mill and hero don't often do very well when spoken in the same breath. But in building all these mill decks, it brought to the mind the very idea for the next couple of videos. You see, in Star Wars Destiny, mill decks often run a bit more control cards than the average deck. It's not like a large amount more, but the idea behind this is that these decks aren't typically defeating characters, and so eventually aggro decks and all their dice start to really outpace your ability to manage the state of the game. Furthermore, it is an inherent property of discarding and milling cards to function as pseudo-control. And heck, what better way to deal with a card than to never let it hit the table, right? This is probably true in most CCGs, actually, and actually Destiny is really no different. In fact, control in Destiny isn't a proper win condition, and I don't think it really is in any other games either. So in order to make like an actual control deck work, there's a pretty high chance in Destiny that you're milling and discarding cards on the way because, well, what other choice do you have? Anyway, all this deck building has made me think about reassessing the idea of the control archetype in Destiny and how we perceive and understand it. And there are a vast variety of control cards in Destiny, and for the most part, they can be broken up into categories, which actually makes it really easy to construct a discussion around. So fair warning, this one's gonna be a two-parter. So in this video, I'm gonna cover just 3 items in this like particular topic. And those are cards that control dice, cards that control upgrades, and cards that control supports. Then at the end of the video, I'll tell you what we're going to cover in the next installment. All right, folks, don't go anywhere just yet because we have a lot to talk about. There are a couple of ways to view control in any CCG. First, you might look at control as an entire deck archetype, and that means that your deck always has an answer to whatever your opponent does. Now, Destiny is a pretty young game, and while the ability to control everything is there, it's not as accessible as you might want it to be because of things like limitations in deck size, or cards locked to certain colors or factions that you really want to use, or character pairings that look really cool, not working out for a number of reasons, and really a plethora of other things, right? So another way, and the more common way to look at control, is as a variant. And what this means is that your deck has a particular win condition, right? Let's say aggro, for example. And you make a deck where it only needs 20 cards to make all your amazing aggro stuff happen so that you can win. So with the leftover card slots, you might elect to throw in some control cards. Now, because of the state of Destiny right now, you'll find that most decks, while not considering themselves a control variant per se, end up having 4 to 6 control cards included in them simply to mitigate damage taken. Typically, these are just die control cards because those are the most common and straightforward to utilize in the game. They don't need a lot of setup, you know? However, a true control variant deck tends to include a wider variety of control cards in them than just these die control cards. So they might attempt to control upgrades or the opponent's hand in addition to removing some dice here and there. Oftentimes, a control variant comes about because some new deck or even an established deck in the meta comes in and threatens to shake things up because it includes a few certain cards that competitive decks can't really typically deal with or can't deal with at that very moment. So in response, you see control variants of popular decks pop up to manage the changes occurring within the meta. Now, which cards those decks choose to utilize will, of course, change over a long enough timeline. So we can only look at them in the context of the current or currently shaping meta, and that's going to be different depending on when you're listening to this video. For now, let's talk about a few of the different types of control cards that Destiny has to offer that you might include in your control variant deck. To get a good grasp of control in Destiny, we need to outline a few of the different types of control cards that exist, and then talk about and break down each one in this video. So the first are die or dice removal cards, or die control cards. The second type are upgrade control cards, and yet another flavor of card tries to control supports. So let's talk about the first one here, which is the die control cards. These are pretty simple. They cost you some amount of resources, might even have some limitation to them, and they remove a die within that limitation or rule. One of the first die removal cards we saw in Destiny was Electroshock. It's yellow, it's neutral, it costs 1, saw a lot of play. It then removes a die, showing a value of 2 or less, and it has a spot yellow requirement. So there's a lot of boxes you need to check in order to be able to play Electroshock. But for a while, this was a 2 of in every yellow deck, and nowadays it's more like a 1 of, and there's 2 reasons for that. The first one is that die values in Destiny are getting higher and higher, and Electroshock is kind of losing its playable value. Also, yellow characters in Destiny tend to have big fat targets on them, so this card can go offline for you for an entire game, and it's going to be a dead card in your hand, and you're only going to be able to use it to discard or reroll. But don't count it out just yet, because it does have its place and its use. So right now, we're going to go over to the explanation screen to look at a few different die control cards and how they both differ and are similar to Electroshock. So we just talked about Electroshock, which is a die control card that controls a single die, and I'm going to throw a few more of these up on the screen so that you can kind of see what some other options are in Destiny. And a lot of these cards are going to be very highly playable cards because of what they do and how good they really are. So the first one we're going to talk about is another yellow removal card, and it's He Doesn't Like You. It's from the Awakening set, and it's pretty bonkers. It's one of the better single die control cards in the game because it gives you the option to select the die that you use and the one your opponent loses. And the text on it, it's also 0 cost, which is amazing. It's for villains, and it's remove one of your dice to remove an opponent's die. It's very simple, very straightforward. You trade a die for a die. You pick both. And it's a very good card because you can ditch a blank to remove a 3-side or a 4-side or whatever you fancy. The trade-off is pretty much as favorable as you can make it. The next card worth talking about here is Manipulate, and this one's a special breed, and it's not alone in what it does, but it's certainly a great card because instead of removing the die like some of these other control cards attempt to do, and that we're going to review today, it turns a die to a blank. It's sort of like a He Doesn't Like You, but approaches control in a different way. It says, turn one of your die to a side showing a blank, and then you can turn an opponent's dice to a side showing a blank. And this play could benefit you if you're playing a support like Meditate, which wants to cannibalize one of your blank dice to turn another die to something. It might help synergize with your Grand Inquisitor aggro deck, or with a card like Anger, which allows you to resolve an opponent's die as if it was your own, as long as it's a damage die. Blue Villain is a deck that has been trying to work on utilizing blanks to its advantage for some time now, and this is one such control option that works pretty well within that theme. Honor Guard is the third card here, and it's different than the first 3 or so we talked about because it's not actually an event, it's a support. And this card is worth talking about for the simple fact that it gives you card advantage, and that's something that we covered in the Lexicon video. And the reason for that is that it can stay on the table between rounds, essentially allowing you to draw a card in its place, and it keeps itself online. So it like banks a removal card for you, as long as you can pay the one to put it out. And it's kind of also like playing a game of chicken with your opponent in some sense, because they see it and they know that you can use it whenever you want. But that's more like along the psychology of this game and less important to this actual discussion. It's because really what it is it's one of only a couple of very transparent removal cards available in the game. And while it only removes damage dice, these are still typically the most removed dice in Destiny. So for 1 resource and no spot requirement and no value limitation, it's pretty great. The last single die removal card that I want to talk about has the option to actually remove a second card if the player so chooses, and it's Detention Center. And this is a newcomer in Empire at War, and it is a pretty nasty card. So it's a 3-cost support, and it's villain only, so it is expensive. And it reads, action, exhaust this support to remove a character die. Then, any player may remove one of their character dice to discard this support from play. So it's kind of worded in a multiplayer kind of way that, oh, well, you could remove player 2's die, but player 3 could remove a character die to nix this off the table so it doesn't affect them later or whatever. But this card is very good, and for reasons that you might overlook because it costs 3, is permanent die removal, and it forces your opponent to make a choice in addition to that, right? With the, do I remove my second die so I don't have to deal with this for the rest of the game or something like that. So with the Tension Center, what you get is the ability to remove a character die every single round that it's out on the board, and it essentially locks out non-unique characters that roll in. And the drawback is that, of course, any player can remove one of their character die to discard this card, but that's a calculated risk that you're making other players choose if they want. Now, if you're following the game, you know that most of the time character dice are the strongest dice. So that second die removal is a really difficult decision for your opponent. They need to play around this card to be able to remove it early. Otherwise, it's going to plague them for the rest of the game. So this is a superb control card, despite it only controlling character dice and nothing else. Now, I want to take a second here to point out that there are also plenty of cards that don't remove dice, but do manipulate them in some way, such as Manipulate. These are also prevalent in the game, and they do see some play. However, directly removing a die is often the best way to control it in Destiny. So while those cards do have merit in certain theme decks, for the purpose of this video, I wanted to show you a variety of cards, whether they be the best cards or the most interesting cards, that contribute to control in either a full archetype or as part of a deck variant. So we just talked about cards that can control a single die, so it's only fair that we talk about 2 dice control cards. And the first one we're going to talk about is Negotiate. It's yellow hero, and it reads, remove one of your character dice to force an opponent to choose and remove 2 of their die. So you have to have rolled in, and the die you remove has to be a character die. And the other stipulation is the opponent gets to choose which of their 2 dice are removed. So it does require you to craft a bit of a favorable board state in order to use, to be effective. But it's almost always a good trade-off for you to pluck a blank off the table to remove a couple of dice. And there are really not a lot of 2-die control cards for heroes, so this one has to be highlighted for that simple fact. The second card that we're going to talk about is the Best Defense, and it's considered one of the best removal cards in the game because all it requires is a red character that you don't mind putting 3 damage on. And the coolest part, of course, is getting to choose which of the dice you remove, unlike Negotiate. And this is where villains have the edge every single time. But they pay for it in different ways, and this one's damage. And it's considered one of the best removal cards in Destiny because it doesn't require you to have dice on the table like Negotiate. It can be used as the first action that someone does in a round. And picking the dice is, well, that's kind of like the cherry on top, I guess. Now, Guard is also another great die control card. It works so well with Blue Hero. It allows you to choose and remove one of your dice showing melee to remove a number of opponent's dice equal to that value. And what you got to know here is it works for modifiers too, and that's why it continues to see play. The problem is that it trades 1 die for usually 2 dice, but sometimes it can be 1 or 3. In a sense, it's like Negotiate, but it doesn't need to be a character die that you remove, which is really nice. The trade-off then becomes possible damage dealt to you for possible damage, or that you deal, for possible damage saved against you, or something else you didn't want your opponent to resolve, like a big resource die or a disrupt against you or something like that. It's a really great card, and because it can remove multiple dice while also still synergizing with its color and faction. And typically, like I said, you're probably gonna remove a 2 melee side. A lot of times you see people cannibalize Ray's +2 melee side for this particular card when she can't resolve it with anything else, and that's really one of the best uses for Guard in the game right now. The fourth card we're going to talk about is Force Misdirection, And it is a really neat blue card, and blue players are always looking for a way to get the most out of this card because it has the potential to not just remove 2 dice, but possibly remove every one of your opponent's die. And it's only limited by the die faces that you personally bring to the game. So in a way, you can predict what decks you'll do best against with this card in your deck, at least where die control is concerned. And it also doesn't require you to remove a die on your side of the table. So the ability to gain board control here as a result of removing all of an opponent's, whatever side you choose, is a really welcome side effect of forced misdirection. Unfortunately for blue, it's not really good at keeping board control, only at getting ahead on actions with things like force speed or raised shenanigans. So maybe in a rainbow deck, it could really shine, to use blue for removal and then also move ahead with something else. But with Kanan being in the game now, this card is seeing a lot more play because he's got that range damage side on him. And that's really what blue hero doesn't have commonly. The fifth and last card we're going to talk about is Twin Shadows. This one is new in Empire at War, and it reads, spot 2 characters with the same title to remove up to 2 dice. And this is such an interesting concept, and it's basically made for decks running 2 Gamorrean guards, but they're not the only 2 characters you can pair up. You can pair up 2 Guavian Enforcers, or 2 Stormtroopers and 2 Guavian Enforcers, or 2 Stormtroopers, 1 yellow hero, and something else to allow you to use Twin Shadows off of them. So there's options here, and for 2 resources, this card's effect is very strong. I see it as, the start of a deck that's really looking to control dice pretty hard while also doing something else on the side. So, essentially a part of a really good control variant deck. It's really too cool to not have mentioned it. So that's why I put it in this particular video, because it's new and it removes 2 dice, which Yellow Villain I don't believe had prior to this. So now the reasons these cards are spread over all the colors and factions is to limit how many you can have in a single deck. That's my theory anyway. And I mentioned way at the beginning of this video that control as an archetype is very hard to create in Destiny. And this is all an illustration of that very fact. It also protects, limiting the amount of these cards in existence protects the idea of the elite character. Elite characters are really good in that they bring 2 dice to the table for their activation, and keeping cards which allow anyone to negate an entire character's activation is sort of a way of maintaining their value, maybe even game balance. So you can get a look into what the designers are perhaps thinking in limiting the amount of these cards in a set. Now, of course, those weren't all the die control cards in Destiny, right? There are so many that I can't possibly put them all in this video, but I think you got the gist of it. And die control, and this is what you have to know, is a key component of any competitive Destiny deck. And as I said earlier, most decks are going to include 4 to 6 of these die control cards just to slow an opponent's damage down. But dice aren't the only problem that we have to deal with in Destiny. Sometimes a popular upgrade is so annoying to deal with that we want to include cards in our deck that eliminate them in some way. For that, die control cards may help alleviate the problem temporarily, but getting rid of the card gets you to the bottom of your issue much more effectively. So let's take a look at some cards that let us control upgrades. The cards you're about to see are all very good at what they do, and there's certainly a very small amount of them, but there's certainly a variety here. And the first one we're going to talk about is Confiscation. It's Yellow Villain, and it's a 0-cost event, and it reads, spend resources equal to the cost of an opponent's upgrade in play to return that upgrade to their hand. So essentially, you can purchase the upgrade back into your opponent's hand, removing the die from the table as well as their investment. And of course, that can get pretty expensive if you're trying to remove something big, but there's no limit to the card that you can bounce to their hand as long as you can pay for it. And as you're going to see by the end of this segment, this is a very unique card because it's the only card that has no upper cap for a single upgrade removal. And so it's pretty unique. And you got to keep in mind that upgrade doesn't just mean weapons. It means things like just regular abilities, like or regular upgrades, like Lure of Power, or upgrade title, or upgrade abilities like Makashi training and force powers and things like that. So it's a card with a hell of a lot of flex to it. The second card we're going to talk about is Fallback, and it's from the new Empire at War set. And, you know, that will work. This one will work quite well in a deck shooting to build for a control archetype, I think. And not just as a variant, but literally as a control archetype. And it's a 4-cost red event, and it's neutral, and it reads, each player may choose one upgrade, starting with you. Discard all upgrades from play that were not just chosen. So it is the only card right now that allows you to wipe the board clean of upgrades, save one chosen by you and all your opponents, right? Because it says each player, right? So again, we got this multiplayer sort of wording in here again. So this can make for some really very incredible plays. It forces the opponent to essentially choose the most valuable upgrade they have on the table and save only that one. As a late game play, this can be the swing that control decks need. And I think the designers knew that when they made it red and neutral. And I know that it costs a lot for resources, but there's this thing called Hidden Agenda that lets you play an event for 2 less. And there's also a hero like General Hux who can reduce the cost of an event as well. And what I want to say last about this card is that do not count it out, because I think Fallback is a sleeper card in this set. I don't think it's going to go away. I think once we see a real fleshed out control archetype deck, this one's going to be in it. So the next card we're going to talk about here is Rend, and it's a card that players were waiting for since the dawn of Spirit of Rebellion. Rend is the answer to all those annoying zero-cost upgrades and supports that exist in Destiny. And those include Imperial Inspection, which we're going to talk about soon, Salvage Stand and Dark Presence, which we're going to talk about in the next installment, and Force Speed. And the list goes on and on and on. It's a card that at the time of this video, people are unsure is going to be meta. Basically, will those other cards that it affects still be good? And will this card then be called upon as a response to them? It's kind of hard to say. But in any case, Rend is a card that is right there in the game now. And if those cards should get out of hand, they should be really wary about this card's presence. Drop Your Weapon is a really nice card, but it's just so niche. I've seen this one played actually in the 3-wide Death Trooper deck because it can meet the spot requirement pretty easy. Let me read the card to you. It's a red villain event for 2, and it says spot 2 red characters to discard a weapon from a ready character. Now, I could also see it being played in a 4-wide deck with like 2 Stormtroopers and 2 other characters. Drop Your Weapon is kind of expensive at 2, but it can hit a weapon costing any amount, just like Confiscate can. But remember, Confiscate is not limited to just weapons, it's upgrades. And I think this was a very good control card to come out of Empire at War for a number of reasons. But I really would have liked to have seen a hero version be able to do something like this too. But for now, villains can deal with weapons really well, but they're going to need 2 red characters alive for it to happen. So basically the name of the game here is play this game early or not at all. And one thing that I want to just kind of point out is that this card is really made with FN2199 in mind, because it says a ready character, and generally the way he is played is he activates very late in his round. But that's not to say that Drop Your Weapon can't be the first thing you do if you have control of the battlefield, to just drop a weapon off of your opponent's character. So keep it in the back of your mind if you're looking to make a deck or include this in a control variant that allows you to get rid of some upgrades, or specifically a weapon, really, really quick. Now, the final card I'm going to discuss here is Imperial Inspection, and I've talked about it many times in other videos, and I'm sure you've already heard about this card, but this one allows you to return an upgrade that costs 2 or less to an opponent's hand when, or not even an opponent's hand, to its controller's hand when you roll a disrupt on one of your dice. So it's then exhausted, so you get to use it once per turn, but you can't have 2 on the board. So the option here is really, really good to use. And, you know, there are still a whole ton of 2-cost upgrades in Destiny that are amazing. And in fact, it's probably the value with the most amount of upgrades available in the game if I had to guess offhandedly. And Imperial Inspection is quite good at what it does, and it's basically the ultimate upgrade removal card and upgrade control card, especially early in the game, because it literally makes your opponent waste money. And with good timing, it's also a die control card as well as an upgrade control card. So how can you beat that? I guess with Ren, because Ren can actually destroy this card. But it is a little early in the Empire at War meta to say that Imperial Inspection is definitely here to stay. And, but thus far, it is proving that it does have some staying power with the decks that I've seen so far, namely Thronkar. And, if you're playing in your local meta right now, you've probably seen Thronkar, and Thronkar is running this card. At least a lot of the versions that I've seen are. So it's still out there. It's still considered one of the best control cards in the game. And I guess we'll see, if it has the legs to carry through into the next set. All right. Well, we've talked about die control cards and upgrade control cards. So I guess that means it's time to talk about support control cards. And there's quite a few in this batch as well. So let's get started so that we can get through them. So we already talked about Rend and how it can remove zero cost supports or upgrades. So we're not going to cover that one again. And the first card we're going to talk about instead is Disable. Now, Disable doesn't remove anything from the board, but it does have an element of control. And there's another card very similar to this on the hero side called Strategic Planning that costs 1 and it's in red that can do something similar. But since I had to pick some cards and not talk about all the cards, I went with this one because it's 0 cost. And it's very simple. It just says exhaust the support. And it's neutral and it's yellow, so actually hero and villain can both play it. And, I don't fancy that this card's going to see like a lot of play, but the potential to take a big vehicle out of the fight for a single round is really nice for no cost to you other than the deck slot. And it also highlights that not all control cards necessarily remove stuff. I focused a lot on removal in the dice section, but really, sometimes you just need to turn something off for a bit, and that can have a big impact too. And Disable is exactly the kind of card that does that, and it remains to be seen whether or not it's going to make any cuts in any decks. But, if vehicle meta becomes prevalent and you're talking about just creating a deck that controls everything possible, well, you've got Disable. Heck, you can even exhaust Imperial Inspection if you really want to protect, your Vibro Knife or something like that on the table. It's totally viable. Sabotage is the second card I want to talk about here, and it's been in the game since the very beginning because it came out with Awakenings, and it has seen some spot play off and on over the many months of this game's life. Sabotage is a 1-cost neutral yellow event, and it reads, discard cards from your hand equal to the cost of a support in play to discard that support. So if you wanted to remove a 2-cost support like Planetary Uprising, you'd pay the 1 and then discard 2 cards from your hand, and Planetary Uprising goes away. It's a high price to pay to get rid of something threatening off the table, but much like Confiscate, it has a pretty good ceiling. The limitation of it is you'll most likely ever remove a 4-cost support, right? Because playing the actual card puts it into limbo, leaving only 4 cards remaining in your hand. And then you have to discard all of them to get rid of that 4-cost support. So some people might still run this as like a 1-of in their deck, but it's not as common these days as it was months ago. And I think it's because people sort of gave up on support control because it's just too hard, and I don't blame them because I wouldn't want to lose half my hand or all of my hand, to remove a card like Planetary Uprising or like a Ghost from the board. But sometimes you just got to do what you got to do in order to turn the tide of a game. Now, the next card, Surgical Strike, is arguably a better option than Sabotage in the support removal area, and Surgical Strike synergizes really well with Red Hero, unlike Sabotage and Yellow Hero. Although I guess that's arguable with cards like, Don't Get Cocky or whatever. But it allows you to remove any number of your red dice showing ranged, increasing their values by 1, to discard a support from play that costs equal to or less than the combined value of those dice. So it's confusing for sure, but I'll give you an example. Say you want to explode an ATST off the table, right? And I'll put ATST up here now because we're going to also talk about it in the next section. it's a 6 cost vehicle. So you could destroy it with Surgical Strike by sacrificing, 2 dice, showing 2 on each of them because each one of them would have their values increased by 1 to 3. And those 2 dice, 3 together, is a total of 6. So you've got a busted ATST. And the more dice you remove, the more value you get out of this card, but also the less damage you're going to do out of that round, in theory. So what this card and the last one both illustrate is that removing supports in Destiny is a real uphill battle. I'm sure that you see that. And that's probably one of the reasons that has contributed to the fact that players have kind of given up on trying to control supports in any kind of special way, because the fact is the price is just too damn high. I sort of did this section as an offshoot because I want to point out that events don't have a monopoly on control supports in this game. In fact, there are 2 villain vehicles that can also remove supports, and the first one is from Empire at War, and it's the ATDP. It's a small vehicle, and it has pretty good die sides, including a special which reads, discard a support that costs 2 or less from play. So the ATDP is tiny, and it can blow up tiny ships, is basically what this is saying. But it can also blow up planetary uprising, right? Which is really cool. And I've never seen anyone do it, but hey, it's possible. That's what the card says you can do. And the point of showing you this and the next card is that I'm going to, is sort of to show you that this is kind of a more cost-effective way of dealing with, supports in the game as far as controlling. And, and you can look at this if this is the route that you decide to go with either your control deck or a control variant deck that you might build in the future. So the second one we've already seen, which is ATST, and it's the biggest baddie of them all. It's the most expensive vehicle that we've seen to date, and it came out in the first set of the game, and it packs a ginormous punch. The special on this, and there are 2 special sides on that die, and no blank, it allows you to just discard a support from play, period. It has no cost restriction like ATDP. It just straight up is like, hey, I blow up your Millennium Falcon, see you later. I blow up your Ghost, I blow up your U-Wing, and it's gone. So again, this seems like a bit more of a cost-effective way to go about things if you can actually, get it onto the board. So, it's, even though it's more cost-effective, it's not necessarily easier to pull off than something like a Sabotage or a Surgical Strike, which, and Surgical Strike tends to be also kind of efficient in what it does, depending on the support you're actually going for. But the moral of the story here is any way that you want to approach support control in this game is pretty rough. There's nothing like Rend to just cover all your bases and cost, so you have to be creative. Personally, I've never seen any of the cards discussed today run consistently or even effectively in any decks, and certainly not the 2 vehicles here just for the support control element. And it's kind of sad because this is an area of Destiny that really needs to be looked at by the designers, if you're going to ask me. If you feel like support control is something that is going to be critical to the life of this game or the advent of a true control deck, then this is the one area that needs a lot of help. Now, we've seen a lot of cards at this point in the video, and this is only the first half of this entire discussion. I know it's crazy to try and break the game down into at this point because we're 3 sets in, but by taking stuff at a glance, I hope that it gives you a solid look into why certain control cards are more popular includes than others. And mainly the more popular ones you're going to see, of course, are the die control cards, right? And this is a summary for those who haven't been taking notes like I've asked you to take in the past, but that's okay. Professor Gray is going to give you a pass on this one. And die or dice control cards, as we talked about, they're not only the most popular includes in decks to mitigate damage and add control elements, but they come in a wide variety across all the colors and all the factions. Some just remove character dice, others target die of certain values, some have spot restrictions to them, some turn dice to different sides, and of all the control cards, they are the most numerous, so you're going to see a lot of them. And remember that to be competitive, it's fairly commonplace to run about 4 to 6 of these cards, so that statistically you see about 1 in 5 of your cards is a control card, and you see about 1 per round. And that's kind of the justification to that in terms of the numbers and the math. We then took a look at some upgrade control cards, and we saw that these also come in a variety of resource costs from 0 all the way up to 4 with fallback from Empire at War. These are crafty cards, and with the exception of Imperial Inspection, not too many of the other ones see consistent play. But I thought this was a good section to go over because it has the ability to impact aggro decks the most. If and when a good, complete, real control deck comes about, upgrade control is going to be at the crux of that deck because aggro decks are always the most common decks that you're going to run into. And I'm saying it now. I think this is the most impactful of the control categories over the long game. So once FFG gives us better cards in the upgrade control area, that's when I think control is really actually going to come into its own. And that said, the last core category and probably the least impactful of all the cards we will discuss was support control. And what I hope you learned from the talk in this section is that support control in Destiny sucks. There are very few options, with Ren still being really the only good one. And still, that card can only remove 0 cost supports and upgrades. And that's such a small slice of the support pie in this game. And without further assistance, supports will just continue to be seen as the most permanent cards on the battlefield. So there's just not really a lot of realistic ways to deal with them with any consistency. So you better hope that you discard those cards out of someone's hand before they hit the table if you don't have a good way to deal with them. Whew, okay. Boy, that was a long one, but chock full of lots of information. And this is all building up to something, and I want you to take something away from it that may not be transparent from simply listening to me talk about these cards and discussing why they're good and bad. And this is it. The control archetype in Destiny needs work if we're gonna one day have an actual control deck. And this is worth being concerned about because control is a viable deck type in several other CCGs. Aggro decks, of course, are always developed first, and they're usually the easiest to play. From there, you usually see control and mid-range decks form up. But with Destiny, the only other archetype that we actually have, aside from mid-range, which is there, is mill and discard. And, rarely are those decks competitive for very long, although Empire at War is really shaking that part up. The point is, control is considered to be part of, kind of a holy trinity in CCGs. And it's kind of not really present in Destiny in a really solid form. However, it is coming along, and this video, as well as the one to follow, is serving to illustrate that the areas in Destiny, where control is weakest. So we talked about support control being definitely weak, and you could argue that upgrade control doesn't see a lot of play either, maybe because it's just not quite there as far as cost for what you're getting out of. But die control has a ton of options, and it's easy to use and include in a deck without changing your win con whatsoever, and that's a conscious decision that the game designers have made. So I know we talked about a lot already, right? And you're thinking, well, damn, what else is there to cover, Gray? 3 more big topics, actually. And they include card control cards, forced play cards, and general board control cards. And it's definitely worth looking at the Guardian keyword too as part of the control archetype as well. So next time we're going to cover all that stuff. So stay tuned for part 2 of this deep dive into the control archetype of Destiny. That will be coming to you as soon as I get it all scrubbed up and looking good for you guys. So again, be ready for that one. It's probably going to be another long one. And until next time, be good, and may the force be with you.